I have played a bunch of game trilogies before, but there are very few cases where the trilogy is so good that I can never really pick my favorite in the three games. The first trilogy that I consider to be the quintessential masterpiece was Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. I think Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney trilogy is one trilogy that I highly recommend to everyone, especially those who want to dive in a little deep into visual novels. I love all the games in the trilogy, and all of them complement each other so well, storytelling wise too. If you haven't played this one, go play them. It's amazing. Another game trilogy that I love is the Prince of Persia trilogy. This is back when Ubisoft actually makes good games and not harass employees left and right. Also, this is back when Ubisoft actually makes good games every year. These three games are released a year apart, and I think all of them are fantastic games. Granted, I love them for different reasons. Not all the games here manage to reach a level of perfection, as all of them have their own quirks and flaws, but as a trilogy, it's absolutely perfect. I love all of these games, and they're also a huge part of my childhood, mostly Warrior Within and the Two Thrones, but still, I love these games. These games are great, and I gotta talk about them because I love to do that. But before I get to all of that, as usual, we got sponsors. Huge thanks to everybody who support me through PayPal, Patreon, etc. You can do so by checking the links down below. Also, you can donate to me on my streams at Streamlabs, link down below, where you get direct and live shout out at Saturday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We also play bingo, in case you're into that sort of thing. It all starts off with the Sands of Time. Well, technically, it all starts off with the original Prince of Persia, which was released back in 1989. The Sands of Time was released in 2004. It's the first game which is a part of the reboot by Ubisoft with the original creator of the franchise, Jordan Mechner. It's one of the few examples in history where the reboot is being helmed by the original creator and is actually far superior to the original. Not to mention, this sits alongside Tomb Raider, where the reboot itself got rebooted again, and the second reboot just couldn't capture the spirit of the first. You know what, New Lara? You're gonna get a revisit. Anyway, in the Sands of Time, you play as an unnamed prince who is still unnamed to this day, or at least until you see the movie adaptation, which, as far as video game adaptations go, it's surprisingly not the worst that I've seen. Ah, that kind of makes sense. During an invasion of some sort, the prince stumbles into a treasure called the Dagger of Time. He's then tricked by the vizier into opening the hourglass of time, and thus he unleashed an evil curse that turns a lot of people, and even animals, into sand monsters. Seriously, those bats can get bent. So the prince has to find a way to restore the balance of the world and undo all of his mistakes with the help of a mysterious woman. The gameplay of the Sands of Time is mostly about that platforming and hack and slash. You as a prince have to go around and stab these sand monsters left and right. You also have to navigate through the many areas around the castle by jumping, wall running, climbing, etc. The platforming in this game is definitely pretty fun and sweet and satisfying to pull off, but I swear to God, these areas were specifically designed for people who can climb, wall run, and get through small cracks and holes, and not for, you know, practical reasons. Seriously, the level design team only thinks about how fun it would be to jump around gameplay-wise, and not how incredibly inconvenient it is for a castle to have switches and giant levers far away from the actual freaking door, or designed in a way that can only be activated by running yourself up a wall. There's a section where you have to activate the castle's defense system, and the activation process is so convoluted that the castle would be annexed by the enemies the moment it's finally on. Even the prince is aware that the defense system is most likely gonna kill him than the invaders. The game's biggest selling point is the ability to use the Dagger of Time to manipulate, well, time. As the prince, you can manipulate time so that you can time travel a couple of moments into the past so that you can redo the errors that you made, whether it be jumping on the wrong area accidentally or being killed by an enemy so that you have a chance to anticipate and dodge the killing blow. There are some secrets and collectibles like the sand clouds you can collect to increase the sand tanks and the hidden areas where you can find health upgrades for the prince. The Sands of Time is the one that I played the least back in my childhood, and sad to say that I haven't actually beaten the game when I was a kid. That's because the PS2 that I had is broken enough to the point where you can actually lose audio entirely while playing the game. So I basically played through loads of PS2 games in freaking silence, and unfortunately one of the segments in the game requires me to listen to certain sounds in order to proceed. So at that point, I was pretty much screwed. So this was the first time I've ever actually beaten the game in my life. Second time actually, now that I've replayed the game again on the PC after I played through it on the HD version on the PS3. And how was it? Well, It's fantastic. The game's narrative content is surprisingly pretty good. The story is very straightforward from start to finish, and it takes place in a very exotic Arabian night setting, but it also has some amazing characterization. The prince on this game narrates through the story from start to finish through his point of view. Sometimes he thinks too loudly and spouts his thoughts for the audience, which does make him quite the prick, but he's actually the likable kind of prick because he's actually flawed and has a natural character growth. Another part that makes the story so special was Farah. She's absolutely amazing in this one, both as the prince's companion and banter partner, and also as a love interest. The story as a whole is top-notch. It's very whimsical and very Disney-esque, if you ask me. Totally recommend. That said, the combat on this one is unfortunately the weakest in the series. It's incredibly repetitive for me to take down the enemies to the point where they fell, and then I have to absorb their sand once they're actually dead, and then having to repeat that thing ad nauseum. Some of the encounters can go on and on and on with no end to boot, and those freaking bats can go screw themselves, honestly. The slow motion ability does slow down time, but it provides little to no competitive advantage because every participant is slowed down, including the prince, so you're still gonna get your ass kicked, except this time in slow-mo. And after replaying the game on the PC, I realized that once you know the attack that knocks the enemy down, the game turns from a walk in a park to sleep in a bench. But still, despite the game's flaws, I can totally see why this game is considered a classic. It has a simple, straightforward story with likable characters that have actual growth. One that is quite an exemplar in video gaming history if you ask me. It's not the best, but it is certainly one of the few good examples in narrative storytelling. If you can get past the really repetitive gameplay, either by just playing through it or with some good old cheats, The Sands of Time is a great game, and I highly recommend it. Now let's get into the most controversial entry in the trilogy, Warrior Within. Warrior Within takes place 7 years after the original. Without spoiling too much, the prince changes the course of history in the first game, and now he has to face the consequences in the form of the Dahaka, a mysterious beast who hunts people that breaks the laws of time and space. The prince cannot run away any longer from his inevitable fate, so he decides to go to the Island of Time to prevent the creation of the Sands of Time, because doing so would mean that it doesn't exist, which means that the Dahaka doesn't exist. That would also mean that the actions that you did in the first game doesn't exist as well, Prince, which means that you're gonna undo all the character growth that you went through just for the sake of shock and awe and dark and edgy. Wow, this game got a lot of flack. It's got so much flack that Jordan bailed out of the project. While the first game is aiming for a magical and whimsical Arabian Nights sort of adventure, this game is aiming for a hardcore, emo, grim dark, with heavy metal soundtrack, blood and gore everywhere, and oh boy, them sexy outfits on them sexy ladies. There's a moment in this game where the camera focuses entirely on Shadi's booty for like 5 seconds before she's finally introduced as a person. The level of grim, dark, hardcore emo in this game is absolutely ridiculous. It's so dark and edgy that the game just can't help but to make everything look super bloody. When you die in the first game, the prince will make some stupid and witty retort.
That's not how it happened.
When you die in this game, jeez, calm down, game. I mean, damn. And it's not just the aesthetic that's changed. It's also the story direction and the prince himself. Gone are the prince's inner thoughts and narration that defines his character and personality. He's still narrating through the game, but it's all exposition and no personality. I have to do X in order to get to Y. I have to get to X in order to get to Y. It's Tomb Raider 2013 all over again. It's all boring fluff that doesn't really define his character, nor does it remind us of how the old prince behaved. Instead, he's the kind of prince that is willing to make some really selfish and questionable decisions as he desperately tries so hard to change his fate and escape from it by causing even more destruction and peril towards both him and the world at large. He reminds me a lot of how Walker was depicted in Spec Ops: The Line, as both characters justify their hardest to commit the most horrendous actions, not out of the greater good, but out of their own warped sense of justice, which just cancels everything that the prince learned from the first game. At least with Walker, he's supposed to be that way. In this one, it only resulted in everything that the prince learned from the first game to be all for nothing. This kind of aesthetic and story direction change got fans of the original super mad, and I can totally see why. But here's the thing, I still absolutely love this game. No, really, I love this game. I absolutely love Warrior Within. Not for the story was just bleh. The improved combat and gameplay mechanics definitely play a factor on why I love it so much. It's bloody, it's brutal, it's nothing like the first game, but it manages to create an identity of its own. And most importantly, it feels dynamic and free-flowing, especially when a lot of it is incorporated with your movements. Weirdly, despite being a game designed for adults, Warrior Within is the game that I played the most when I was a kid. I guess I'm a really edgy kid back then. I've been in this game like several freaking times because it's so much fun. The combat is so much fun, and the platforming as well is so much fun. The game does manage to combine the platforming and the combat elements nearly seamlessly, so you can pull off acrobatic combos while jumping to the enemies left and right. The game also allows you to use two weapons at the same time, which opens the game up to really deadly and really cool looking combos. Point is, it's freaking fun, and Warrior Within did two things that the other Prince of Persia didn't do. The first one is a non-linear level design. You have the ability to travel from one place to another and then go back to that same place in case you want to do something else there. But you also have the ability to travel from one time to another through the use of time portals, as there are areas that are simply inaccessible in the past that you can access by going to the present, or vice versa. On paper, it feels very Metroidvania-ish, but in execution, it's still just a linear way through. But still, it's a really nice idea. And the second one is the Dahaka. The Dahaka is the game's overarching villain, and the primary reason why the prince has to go back in time to prevent the creation of the Sen. And boy, this beast is unstoppable. The Dahaka is quite the monstrous beast that will pretty much annihilate anything in front of it just so that he can get to his target. You know that he's close the moment everything around you is turned sepia all of a sudden. Almost all of your encounters with him, you have no option but to run. You can't fight him, you can't reason with him, you just gotta run and run like your life depends on it. This pretty much turns some parts of the game into an actual horror game. You gotta pull off whatever acrobatic stunts you can get in order to get from point A to point B and get as far away from that beast as possible. So being the overarching villain, do you actually get to fight the Dahaka? Well, that really depends, because this game has two endings. Only the canon ending is where you get to fight the Dahaka, and this gets me to an aspect that I really despise: mandatory health upgrades. The game's canon ending requires you to find the life upgrades around the area, which in turn would lead you into the water sword, which allows you to defeat the Dahaka. That would be okay if the life upgrades are easy to find. But they're not easy to find. They're pretty freaking hard to find. I need a guide just to remind me of it. One of the life upgrades even require you to backtrack all the way to the early areas of the game. I've beaten the game when I was a kid, and most of the time, I got the bad ending. It's only when I know how to use the interwebs that I realize that there's another goddamn ending, and I could have gotten that if I got all the life upgrades. So yeah, despite all of that, I love this game. Not just because it's an adorable little game trying way too hard to be super dark and edgy, but it's super fun enough to play that it has a special place in my childhood. As an adult, I still really enjoy this game, and the booty is a nice bonus if you ask me. Appreciate it, because you won't see any Western game developers do this anymore, especially Ubisoft. Still wouldn't stop them from harassing those employees though. This game is super freaking fun, and I love it to death, though it's a bit buggy on the PS3 HD Trilogy version. Sometimes the game plays no music at all, and sometimes the game straight up froze my PS3. It only sometimes happens on my PC though, without the freezing. Regardless, Warrior Within is the black sheep of the trilogy, and one that doesn't jive with the fans of the original, and even the creator of the original, for totally understandable reasons. But still, I really love it. The Two Thrones is the next game in the series, released next year after Warrior Within. I mean, damn, Ubisoft. How can you start out from a company that turned out great games every year into a company that turned off garbage every year? Regardless, The Two Thrones is pretty much the answer to a lot of people's criticisms on Warrior Within, like the dark and edgy tone and the prince being a jackass. That said, the story is still a continuation on the second game, and people hate the direction of the second game so much that they'd rather just forget that game altogether. Still, you can't fault the devs for listening to feedback and try to remedy what was broken, especially those employees that you harass, Ubisoft. I think you should do a lot of remedy in that. that. Following the canon ending of the second game, where the prince beats the Dahaka, the prince goes back to Babylon with Kailina, the sexy girl in the red dress from Warrior Within, who is a lot more sensibly dressed, looks a lot older for some reason, and also the narrator of the game. The prince later finds out that Babylon has been besieged by none other than the Vizier from the first game. Yup, the Vizier continues his plans of immortality and world domination, and insert generic villain motivation here, and while the prince did prevent the creation of the Sands of Time and the Dahaka for chasing him, he still didn't stop the Vizier from trying to take over the world.
Of course!
Despite being depicted with some sort of illness in the original Sands of Time, which is the primary reason why he's seeking immortality, he's still alive and kicking for about 7 years, oddly enough, and the Vizier succeeded in not just taking over Babylon, but also taking the Dagger of Time, using it to turn himself into an immortal and monstrous being. The prince manages to retrieve the Dagger of Time from the whole mess, which also affected him as the prince is cursed by the sands that led into the creation of his alter ego, the Dark Prince. It's up to him and the Dark Prince to stop the Vizier and reunite with an unexpected companion. On paper, the two thrones seems to be a combination of Sands of Time and Warrior Within. It takes the combat elements from Warrior Within with the storyline of the Sands of Time. The prince has to stop the Vizier again, and he has to do it with Farah again. While that's definitely true on paper, the overall tone of this game is more like a balance between Sands of Time and Warrior Within. It only barely reaches that whimsical Arabian Nights vibe that Sands of Time captured so well, and it only barely reaches the overly dark and edgy vibe of Warrior Within. That amount of balance creates this grounded and realistic vibe, which I actually kinda like. That said, the two thrones have a couple of things that differentiate itself from the previous two games. For one, there's a stealth element in the game, and it's actually not that bad. One of the game's newest feature is this speed kill, which allows you to kill any unaware enemies as quick as possible. Some of the speed kills even evolve to the point of killing two enemies or killing enemies straight off of a wall jump. What's really amazing about the stealth is that there are platforming sections around the enemies that allow you to navigate from one point to the other at the top of the enemies so that you can strike them behind their backs. It's surprisingly pretty fun. Another gameplay addition is the Dark Prince section, where you have to turn into the Dark Prince and play as him. What's different between him and the normal prince is that his life slowly degenerates, but you can refill it by acquiring Sands of Time. His sections also have platforming exclusive methods where only he can proceed through the levels and the prince cannot. All his sections will end the moment the prince submerges his foot in water. The Dark Prince also has chains as his secondary weapon, which allows you to beat the crap out of enemies using it. It even has its own exclusive speed kill animations, where you have to choke the enemies with your chain to decapitate them. In terms of storyline, the Dark Prince is the prince's inner monologue, a side of him that reflects so much of his past mistakes and arrogance. A lot of times, the Dark Prince will make snide and cynical comments about the prince's actions, including your performance in combat, where he will mock you for sucking a lot. There's a lot of back and forth between the two, and I find it very amusing. It's kind of like a dialogue between a character and their shadow in Persona 4, except it happens throughout the entire game. As for the actual interactions between Prince and Farah, it's nowhere near as good as the first game. There are times where the prince is being an idiot when they're together. For example, this moment right here when they met the Vizier in his true form, Farah told the prince that he should be happy that he's gone because he'd never stood a chance against him. The prince responded in a weirdly rude and sarcastic manner.
Oh, how silly of me. You're right. Perhaps we should surrender. Or turn away and leave the city. I know a lovely little island just a few weeks' journey from here. I'm sure by the time we return, this will all be sorted out.
Where did that come from? She never said that we should surrender, you prick. Some interactions are weirdly out of place, like Farah suddenly asking the prince on what his favorite color is when they're in an elevator. Some of them also don't make sense. Farah hates the prince because he lied about being the Dark Prince, which would have been a dramatic moment if the prince was not shirtless and didn't show off his big-ass freaking glowing arm. I don't understand why at no point in the game has Farah asked him, what the hell happened to your arm and why is it glowing so much? It would have saved a lot of the arbitrary and forced character conflict. I can feel that the writers are trying to recapture the magic of the interactions between the two back in Sands of Time, but it really felt forced and unnatural and makes no sense here. It felt like a lot of writing efforts is being put on the prince and his dark side interactions, rather than the interactions between the two former main characters of the previous game. With all that said, the two fronts managed to hit a happy medium between good gameplay and good story in the series. The story is definitely definitely better than Warrior Within for a couple of different reasons. The interactions between the prince and the dark side is pretty amusing and funny at times. Despite his tendencies on being a prick, there's an actual character arc and growth for him that makes a lot more sense and more coherent than whatever Warrior Within has. I also find Kalina's narrations to be weirdly comforting and nostalgic, and her narration adds enough for the story to be intriguing, compelling, and not as grim, dark, edgy as the last game. And the ending of this game is a really nice way of calling back to the first game. So yeah, The Two Thrones is great as well, and this is one of the games that I played pretty often when I was a kid, alongside Warrior Within, so this definitely has a place in my heart, and I would definitely recommend this game for those who are interested in an action-adventure platformer. In fact, I recommend all three games if you're interested in that. In conclusion, what else can I say about the Prince of Persia trilogy? It's the one game that I went back to and revisit, and I still absolutely love it. There are definitely flaws in each and every game, but at the same time, there are also strengths on them that really manage to complement each other's weaknesses. It's one of those trilogies that I see as a complete package rather than an individual game. So I can't put any one of the three games in my favorite of all time list because they're part of a trilogy. They're a complete package, and no amount of reboots or last-minute movie tie-ins can change that. I personally recommend the PC version. The three games can pretty much run on almost any modern PC these days, and they can run on 1080p 60 FPS. That's all for the video today. Thank you so much for watching. Go like and subscribe, and make sure to follow and support me through the links down below.